What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my DFS picks for NFL Week 9. Final look.
These picks apply for DraftKings and FanDuel. Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to go over each position and break down a couple of my favorite players for this NFL DFS main slate. And if you stick around to the very end of this video, we'll use the Draft Dashboard tools to make a DFS lineup using the picks we just made. Okay guys, NFL Week 9, let's take a look at the quarterback position. So I like Russell Wilson and Josh Allen in this Seattle versus Buffalo game. I think both of these quarterbacks have some big upside in this game. Vegas thinks there's going to be 54.5 points scored in this game, so a high-scoring game. They have the Seattle Seahawks favored by 3, so a close, competitive game. And for Josh Allen, he's got a fantastic matchup here, as the Seattle Seahawks has the second worst defense overall, and they give up the second most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. So I like Josh Allen. I like Russell Wilson. Russell Wilson's been on fire this season, scoring 29, 36, and 26 fantasy points in the last 3 games. He's averaging 32 fantasy points per game on the season. He's going to be about 8% owned here, projected at 24.8 fantasy points. He's 7,600 DraftKings salary and 1,400 more on FanDuel. Now, Chris Carson is out, so it's most likely going to be a heavy passing game script. So Russell Wilson is a top quarterback play here in Week 9, and Josh Allen is also a top quarterback play with a fantastic matchup versus the Seattle Seahawks. Should be a ton of fantasy points scored in this game, so I like Russell Wilson and Josh Allen here in this Buffalo-Seattle game. Oh, and Josh Allen is going to be about 14% owned. So I think he's going to be more owned because of the better matchup versus Seattle. He's only 600 DraftKings salary less than Russell Wilson. So I think it would be a toss-up for me between those two quarterbacks. I'll have some lineups with both of those guys. But let's move on to the other quarterbacks on this slate. If you're looking for a quarterback with lower ownership, take a look at Ben Roethlisberger from the Pittsburgh Steelers playing the Dallas Cowboys, who have the 5th worst defense overall, and they're middle of the pack defending opposing quarterbacks. Ben Roethlisberger has averaged 18.1 fantasy points per game on the season. He's going to be about 2% owned, projected at 19.8 fantasy points here in Week 9. He's 6,500 DraftKings salary and 1,200 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 43 points scored in this game, and they have the Pittsburgh Steelers favored by 14.5. So just an awful defense for the Dallas Cowboys. Ben Roethlisberger has a great matchup here. Looks like Pittsburgh Steelers should score most of these 43 points. So I like Ben Roethlisberger, especially at that 2% ownership. He could have 4 touchdowns in this game. So I like Ben Roethlisberger here versus the Dallas Cowboys. Now, if you're looking for a low salary quarterback that can get it done for you here, take a look at Derek Carr from the Las Vegas Raiders playing the LA Chargers, who have a middle of the pack defense overall, but they give up the second most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Derek Carr has averaged 19.8 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 3 rush attempts per game. He played in a bad weather game last week, only scored 13 fantasy points, but he scored 20 and 28 fantasy points in the 2 games before that bad weather game. He's going to be about 6% owned, projected at 17.6 fantasy points here in Week 9. He's 5,700 DraftKings salary and 1,300 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 51.5 points scored in this game, with the Raiders trailing by 1. So great matchup, a pretty high scoring game here, and a competitive game. So I like Derek Carr here versus the LA Chargers. And if you're really looking to save some salary at the quarterback position, another quarterback with low ownership and a fantastic matchup, take a look at Drew Lock from the Denver Broncos playing the Atlanta Falcons, who have the 4th worst defense overall, and they give up the absolute most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Drew Lock scored 21 fantasy points last game. He's only going to be about 3% owned, projected at 17.2 fantasy points here in week 9. He's $5,200 DraftKings salary and $2,000 more on FanDuel. So I like that DraftKings price. Vegas thinks there's going to be 50 points scored in this game, and they have the Broncos trailing by 4. So he's got one of the best quarterback matchups on the slate versus an Atlanta Falcons secondary that hasn't played well all season long. And it should be a passing game script. So I like Drew Lock as a low salary, high risk, high reward play here versus the Atlanta Falcons. Okay, let's take a look at the running back position. So at the top here, I like Dalvin Cook from the Minnesota Vikings playing the Detroit Lions, who have the 9th worst defense overall, and they give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Dalvin Cook has averaged 28.7 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 20.3 rush attempts per game and 3.2 pass targets per game. He had a monster game last week, scoring 52 fantasy points off of 30 rush attempts and 3 pass targets. He's going to be about 31% owned, projected at 21.7 fantasy points here in week 9. He's $8,200 DraftKings salary and $1,100 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 50.5 points scored in this game, with the Vikings favored by 5. So fantastic matchup here, coming off of that monster game with such a great matchup. And actually, it's not a blowout here, only a 5-point favorite here versus the Detroit Lions, even without Matthew Stafford. But likely the Minnesota Vikings are going to take the lead here. Dalvin Cook could get a ton of work here in this one. So I like Dalvin Cook here versus the Detroit Lions. Another running back I like is James Robinson from the Jacksonville Jaguars playing the Houston Texans, who have the 2nd worst defense overall, and they give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing running backs. James Robinson has averaged 20.1 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 15.3 rush attempts per game and 4.6 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 16% owned. He scored 35 fantasy points last week off of 22 rush attempts and 6 pass targets. He's projected at 17.7 fantasy points here in week 9. He's $7,000 DraftKings salary and $300 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 50.5 points scored in this game, and they have the Jaguars trailing by 6.5. So great matchup here for James Robinson. And although it should be a passing game script with the Jacksonville Jaguars playing from behind, James Robinson is involved in the passing game. He got 6, 4, and 7 pass targets in the last 3 games. So he'll be on the field catching passes, even if they're behind in this one. So I like James Robinson here versus the Houston Texans.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smiggity smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NFL slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again and good luck.
And probably my favorite running back on the slate, I like James Conner from the Pittsburgh Steelers playing the Dallas Cowboys, who have the 5th worst defense overall, and they give up the 8th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. James Conner has averaged 17 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 15.7 rush attempts per game and 3.3 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 12% owned, projected at 17.4 fantasy points here in week 9. He's $6,900 DraftKings salary and $1,300 more on FanDuel. So with the Pittsburgh Steelers favored by 14.5, James Conner could get a lot of work early and through the 4th quarter. And I do think Dallas is going to keep this a little bit closer than that 14-point spread. So I like James Conner here versus the Dallas Cowboys. Okay, if you're looking to save some salary at the running back position, take a look at Justin Jackson from the LA Chargers playing the Las Vegas Raiders, who have the 12th worst defense overall, and they give up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Justin Jackson scored 17 fantasy points last game off of 17 rush attempts and 5 pass targets. He's going to be about 14% owned, projected at 13.6 fantasy points here in week 9. He's only $4,900 DraftKings salary and $1,000 more on FanDuel. So we know Vegas thinks there's going to be 51.5 points scored in this game, with the Chargers favored by 1. Great matchup here, close, competitive game. Justin Jackson looks like he's taken over the backfield here. Got over 20 touches last week. I expect that to continue. His salary is low. It will open up your salary for other positions. So I like Justin Jackson here versus the Las Vegas Raiders. Okay, who do we have at the wide receiver position? I like Stefon Diggs from the Buffalo Bills playing the Seattle Seahawks, who have the 2nd worst defense overall, and they give up the absolute most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Stefon Diggs has averaged 18.8 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 9.9 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 21% owned, projected at 18.1 fantasy points here in week 9. He's $7,400 DraftKings salary and $200 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 54.5 points scored in this game, with the Bills trailing by 3. So fantastic matchup, high scoring game, passing game script. So I like Stefon Diggs here versus the Seattle Seahawks. Another wide receiver I like is Keenan Allen from the LA Chargers playing the Las Vegas Raiders, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall. They've been middle-of-the-pack defending opposing wide receivers. Keenan Allen has averaged 18.7 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 10.7 pass targets per game. He scored 22 and 26 fantasy points in the last 2 games. So he's put up 48 fantasy points in 24 pass targets over the last 2 games. He got 11 pass targets last game and 13 pass targets the game before that. So monster volume. He's going to be about 24% owned, on the field for 84% of the snaps, projected at 18.6 fantasy points here in week 9. He's $7,000 DraftKings salary and $500 more on FanDuel. So I like Keenan Allen here versus the Las Vegas Raiders. And then I like Tyler Lockett from the Seattle Seahawks playing the Buffalo Bills, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall. And although they're pretty good versus opposing wide receivers, Tyler Lockett has averaged 22.1 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 9 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 21% owned, projected at 18.2 fantasy points here in Week 9. He's $6,800 DraftKings salary and $600 more on FanDuel. So we know this is going to be a high-scoring game and a close, competitive game. And we know Chris Carson is out, so it's going to be a passing game script. And despite the bad matchup here, although the Buffalo Bills have been pretty good versus opposing wide receivers, Tyler Lockett is going to have the better matchup because DK Metcalf is going to be drawing the shadow coverage from their best cornerback. So that's going to leave Tyler Lockett open for the majority of the targets. So I think he's set to have a big game here this week. So I like Tyler Lockett here versus the Buffalo Bills. Okay, and one of my favorite wide receivers here this week is Terry McLaurin from the Washington football team playing the New York Giants, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing wide receivers. Terry McLaurin has averaged 17 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 9.9 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 10% owned, projected at 15.8 fantasy points here in Week 9. He's $6,500 DraftKings salary and $700 more on FanDuel. So Terry McLaurin has been getting a ton of volume, and that should continue this week because the Washington football team has a bunch of injuries at the wide receiver position. So Terry McLaurin should see double-digit targets again here in Week 9. So I like Terry McLaurin here versus the New York Giants. So now this was my favorite wide receiver play before we heard that Matthew Stafford had COVID-19 and is going to be out for Week 9. But I still think he's worth a look here. I like Marvin Jones Jr. from the Detroit Lions playing the Minnesota Vikings, who have the absolute worst defense overall, and they give up the second most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Marvin Jones Jr. scored 19 fantasy points off of 7 pass targets last game because Kenny Golladay is going to be out. He got injured last game, so Marvin Jones Jr. should get a ton of targets in this game. He's going to be about 12% owned, projected at 12.7 fantasy points here in Week 9, and he's only $5,100 DraftKings salary and $1,000 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 50.5 points scored in this game, with the Lions trailing by 5. So fantastic matchup, passing game script. The risk here is that it's not going to be Matthew Stafford throwing him the ball, so you're not sure what you're going to get. But these are NFL quarterbacks, guys, and Marvin Jones Jr. should get a ton of pass targets. So I like Marvin Jones Jr. here versus the Minnesota Vikings. And if you're looking to save some salary at the wide receiver position, take a look at Jerry Jeudy from the Denver Broncos playing the Atlanta Falcons, who have the 4th worst defense overall, and they give up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Jerry Jeudy scored 11 fantasy points last game off of 10 pass targets. He's only going to be about 5% owned, projected at 12 fantasy points here in Week 9. He's $4,700 DraftKings salary and $1,000 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 50 points scored in this game. They have the Broncos trailing by 4, so fantastic matchup here. High scoring game and a passing game script. Tim Patrick, he's been injured. I'm not sure how healthy he's going to be this week. We got to keep an eye on that one. But with or without Tim Patrick, it looks like Jerry Jeudy is becoming one of Drew Lock's favorite targets. So I like Jerry Jeudy here versus the Atlanta Falcons. Okay, moving on to the tight end position. I like Darren Waller from the Las Vegas Raiders playing the LA Chargers, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they give up the 8th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Darren Waller has averaged 14.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 8.7 pass targets per game. He played in a bad weather game last week, only scored 8 fantasy points, but he scored 17 and 16 fantasy points in the games before that. He's going to be about 16% owned, projected at 14.5 fantasy points here in week 9. He's $5,800 DraftKings salary and $600 more on FanDuel. So Darren Waller is set up for a nice bounce back game here. He was kind of a letdown last week, but that was to be expected. The weather was awful. So we should have a nice bounce back game here in a great matchup. So I like Darren Waller here versus the LA Chargers. And one of my favorite tight ends on the slate this week is Noah Fant from the Denver Broncos playing the Atlanta Falcons, who have the 4th worst defense overall, and they give up the absolute most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Noah Fant has averaged 12.2 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 7.2 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 16% owned, projected at 11.5 fantasy points here in week 9. He's $4,600 DraftKings salary and $1,200 more on FanDuel. So fantastic matchup here, a passing game script. Salary is right on this play, so I like Noah Fant here versus the Atlanta Falcons. Okay, now if you're looking for a low ownership tight end, take a look at Jimmy Graham from the Chicago Bears playing the Tennessee Titans, who have the 7th worst defense overall, and they're middle of the pack defending opposing tight ends. Jimmy Graham has averaged 9.7 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6.1 pass targets per game. He got 7, 6, and 8 pass targets in the last 3 games, and he's only going to be about 1% owned, projected at 9.6 fantasy points here in week 9, and he's only $3,800 DraftKings salary and $1,500 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 47 points scored in this game, with the Bears trailing by 6.5. So we got a passing game script here. He's getting plenty of pass targets, just waiting for him to find the end zone. Low ownership on this play, the low salary, so I like Jimmy Graham here versus the Tennessee Titans.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all the tools for NFL, MLB is still going, NBA is right around the corner. This is a great time to get in and try everything for 1 month. The tools are all about saving research time. You can see the last 3 games, the fantasy points per game, the targets they got per game, so you can see how involved they are in the offense, the rushes they got per game. Seeing all this stuff on one screen helps you save time and make better picks. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups.